Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Inter-American Dialogue. I'm Michael Shifter. I'm the president, and it's a pleasure to have all of you with us this morning for a session that focuses on a recent report published by the Inter-American Development Bank, The Cost of Crime in Latin America and the Caribbean. And we're extremely grateful to the bank for their collaboration in this presentation this morning. This report has already drawn a lot of press coverage and media coverage. There was a column last week's Economist that you may have seen that described it as a pioneering study in the context of Latin America that in some aspects areas is getting better and has gotten better, but the one persistent problem that in some countries is getting worse and poses an enormous obstacle to development is crime and violence. And this is a study that attempts to look at the cost of the crime and violence for many countries that are facing enormous economic difficulties and are really struggling and have less fiscal space than they had perhaps 5 or 10 years ago. So this is a critical problem and issue, and we're grateful and thank the bank for pursuing this topic and for shining a light on an important issue. And the idea this morning is to hear from friends at the bank and then have a good discussion and exchange on what was found and also what the implications might be, what the policy implications might be for this study, because really the figures in this report are quite staggering in terms of the cost for Latin America. So I think it's an issue that all of us should be aware of. Let me, we're going to have a opening with a brief some opening remarks from Natalie Alvarado, who is the principal specialist in the area of citizen security at the bank. And Natalie has overseen a lot of projects, and the bank has been extremely active on this issue for a number of years. And she has overseen, I think, some very interesting, important projects. So we're grateful to Natalie for being with us this morning to open up. She'll be followed by Laura Jackman, who is also at the bank. She's a citizen security specialist, and she will tell us about the report. She is one of the authors of the report, and we'll share some of the main findings and talk about what they mean. And we're extremely delighted to have with us this morning two colleagues to share some comments and reflections to open up the discussion with all of you. Angela May is the Chief of Research and Trend Analysis Branch at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. She has a very impressive career for 20 years working with the United Nations, and is very overseen a lot of reports, publications, and projects on issues related to drugs, to crime, and has a very extensive knowledge and command of these issues. So we're grateful to you for joining us this morning, Angela, down from New York to be with us. And we're also very pleased to have Desmond Arias with us. Desmond is an associate professor at George Mason University. He is very well known in the field of Latin American violence and crime. He has done a lot of extensive field work in the region, and he has a book that's coming out soon on criminal organizations and government processes with a focus on Brazil, Colombia, and Jamaica. So look out for that book, and maybe we'll have a book presentation when you come out. So thank Desmond very much for coming over and joining us as well this morning. So, and then after that, we'll open up to all your comments and questions. Let me just give a thanks to Pablo Bachelet, who I see out there, a good friend who from the Inter-American Development Bank and works in communications, external relations for really helping making this possible. So thank you, Pablo. So with that, I'll turn it over to Natalie.
Thank you, Michael. Good morning to everybody, and thank you to the Inter-American Dialogue for giving us the opportunity to share this report. Thank you, Michael, Angela, and also Professor Desmond for participating in this event. We are very grateful. Well, as you know, crime and violence is a great challenge to Latin America and the Caribbean. Actually, it's the most violent region in the world. And then we know that crime and fear of crime poses a lot of challenge, and especially for individuals, but also in the economies of the countries in Latin America. Affects the behaviors of individuals, constrain investment, erode also the trust in institutions, as well as distort allocation of private and public resources. As Laura is going to present, we will see how also the cost of crimes, and how crime and violence has a very big impact on social and economic development, and this is what we're going to see today. We've been working at the IDB for more than 15 years, and we support the countries with operation as well as with technical and financial support. And then we know and we understand that crime and violence is a very complex phenomenon, and also it poses a lot of challenging for the policymakers and how to create public policies based on evidence. And this is why at the IDB, besides we're doing operation, we're really pushing for a very strong knowledge agenda. And this is part of what we also want to contribute to the region, is how to provide the evidence and construct with them so we know what works, what doesn't work. Unlike other development disciplines, as you know, education and health, the body of literature in violence and crime and violence is very, very little. And this is why I think this type of work is very unique in this kind. We at the IDB, we need and we try to push a more rigorous research agenda, because what we want is the countries to have policy based on evidence. One of the big constraints that we have in the countries and people that are used to working in Latin America is the lack of good data and information. And not only to have the data, and when they have it, is how they use it, how they analyze it, and that they see it as an opportunity to create, to learn, but also to explore other solutions. And this is one of the reason why we wanted to present this report, The Cost of Crimes, because it's based on the information that was available and how rich this kind of information can inform. So people start thinking about new solutions. And then we saw by the report the interest of governments, but also about other institutions, corporations, other development banks that are very interested in trying to help the countries. Let me tell you about two very important information maybe that will be interested. But next month we are going to launch a visualization tool. Let me show you. It's called DataSec. It's our one-stop shop for crime and violence data. It's an interactive digital platform that enables a spatial visualization of more than 20 indicators of violence across the region. We realized that many countries had advanced in the crime statistics, but the information was very dispersed. We know that the UNODC was one of the that started the effort of putting together the homicides. Imagine. Now with DataSec, what we put in there is more information about crime and violence, and it will visualize the data at the country level, as you can see that in the slide, mostly from UNODC. For example, you can see homicide rates from the region. We have data from 2000, 2014, and also we can see other variables. The second component is the most disaggregated data that is also available by country in any given indicator from their official crime statistics. In summary, the idea is to have all the information available, consolidated in one place. We collect the data, we clean it, we made it available for you, and it's user-friendly. This platform also allows you to visualize the data in graph and tables. And we believe in a couple of weeks, Rogelio, you tell me, right? Yes, you should be able to access to this platform and the IDB Citizen Security website. Now let me tell you about two upcoming publications that I'm sure you will be very interested. One of them is Restoring Paradise in the Caribbean, and it's the first time in the Caribbean we conducted a household and also business victimization survey. And these surveys will help us to understand crime from a very primary source, which is the victimization surveys. And that with the data that we are generating, we can answer questions like, for example, what are the size of the dimensions of the crime in the Caribbean, how the Caribbean compares to the other regions, who are the victims, what are the drivers. So it's a very interesting report that it will come up soon. Another report that we are preparing, that we are going to launch at the end of this year, and it involves taking a deep dive into the penitentiary systems of the region. We conducted penitentiary surveys to better characterize the prison's population, and the idea is to answer the question is, who is in the prison in Latin America? And that for two reasons. One is we have to understand who are in the prison, so we can also see what are the risk factors that are driving people in prisons, but also to understand what are the better mechanisms for the rehabilitation and reinsertion into the society. So the reentry process is very key. We don't focus on the infrastructure, we focus on individuals. So this, now coming back to this latest study, the cost of crime, and I don't know if you also had the opportunity to read the first one that was launched in 2015. It was about 4 countries in Latin America. And this new publication is an expanded version of that with very rigorous methodology and involves around 17 countries. And what we want to understand here is what are the costs behind homicides, the private sector, the public spending on security, the penitentiary system, violence against women, but also we start to exploring emerging threats like the cybercrime and new forms of organized crime. But this topic is not, there is no room for intuition. At the IDB, we think that this report is very relevant for 3 main reasons. The first one is it helps us to characterize and qualify the problem. And I think this is very important for decision-making process. Second, we can create more awareness about the problem based on evidence. And the third, and we believe is the most important, is allow governments and the international community to better allocate resources, but also to focus the efforts in the most promising areas. And especially is to understand what are the costs, and if the cost that we're doing and that we are, and the money to spend is very cost effective. And finally, and I will take the advantage for that, is that we hope that this study will also help to create some awareness in governments and other actors in the region to produce and use the data so they can base and guide their evidence-based policies in the region. Now I will pass to Laura Hagman, who will share more details about that report and also the methodology behind that study. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to all of you for coming. We are very honored. Thank you, Natalie, for your support and for fighting for this agenda. Thank you, Angela, Desmond, Michael, for the opportunity and the availability. And big thanks to all the team of the IDB, all the contributors for this study that were really important to make all of this possible. So the main aim of public policies is to allocate the limited resources to increase the welfare of the citizens. So use the limited resources in such a way that they are more efficiently used and the welfare of us, of all the citizens, is increased. With this report, we want to show that crime, apart from producing losses like homicides that are infinite or damages, there are also economic losses, there are also welfare losses. And why? Because crime is costly. crime alters our decisions, our behaviors, the allocation of resources, as Natalie said. So with this report, we want to convey the message that governments have a great opportunity in increasing the welfare of the citizens if they can reduce crime and its costs. That in the region, they turn out to be very large, unfortunately. For you to have an idea, Latin America and the Caribbean has a homicides rate about 25 homicides per 100,000 population. Angela, am I correct? UNODC is the leader and producing homicides reports. And it's 4 times the global rate, 6 times the US rate, 20 times the rate of European countries. So in the aggregate, at the regional level, Latin America and the Caribbean is the most violent with respect to homicides. Of course, this aggregate disguises many heterogeneities across countries. We have countries in Central America, like Honduras or El Salvador, with homicide rates around 60, or that are 4 times Mexico, that is in the median of this sample of 17 countries that we are analyzing, or 20 times Chile. And of course, inside the countries, there is also a lot of geographical variation on crime. So by no means I want to make a deterrence effect on you visiting the region. There are very safe places, as there are in the US, and there are very dangerous places. But in the aggregate, there is a serious problem on crime and violence in the region that is unfortunately a huge challenge, and no wonder that is the main concern of the population and a top priority of our governments. So when we started studying the cost of crime, what we found useful is to think what we could include in that abstract context, an abstract concept. Like, we tend to think about crime related to violence, to homicides, to other types of property crimes. But what are the costs of crime? So we found useful to make kind of a list. And I invite you to do that list mentally now with me. For sure, in the cost of crime, we will include public spending on security, police, prison administration, judiciary, private spending, so what firms and households spend on private security, cameras, CCTVs, alarms. There are also material losses associated to crime, damages, of course, lives lost. The cost for aggressors, they have to exert some kind of effort. They fear apprehension potentially or face sentences. There are families of victims. They have losses in terms of quality of life. And of course, if we start thinking more deeply about this list of costs of crime, we would include many other costs that are more indirect or intangible costs. For example, how we change our behavior, how we decide when and where to go because of the fear of crime, how firms decide when or where to invest or not, or how children that live in the context of domestic violence may have consequences in terms of health or education. So as you see, there are many, many consequences of crime that could potentially be a cost for the economy. So this whole exercise is trying to put those costs, or some of those costs, as I will explain you, in terms of money, in terms of monetary terms, just for you to have an idea of the magnitude of the problem, and also by analyzing these costs to understand what are potential opportunities of improving the allocation of our limited resources. We economists like to talk about welfare. Underlying all this, we think that there is a welfare level in the economy without crime, and that crime reduces that welfare level. And the challenge is to estimate the size of that welfare loss. Yes. Different methodologies will estimate that welfare loss in different ways. If we take that welfare loss as a whole, there are some methodologies called the contingent valuation that think, okay, people will be willing to pay at least the amount of that cost to reduce crime or to stop crime. So to measure that is really hard. One way is by surveys, by asking people, how much are you willing to pay to reduce homicides in your city or to stop crime in your country? As you can imagine, the problem with that kind of surveys is that when people are asking a hypothetical situation, how much are we willing to pay, we will be willing to pay much more than what we actually would pay in a real setting. No? But they can give you some estimates of that willingness to pay, of that whole cost of crime. Other ways to measure as a whole this welfare loss is with hedonic prices, with methodologies used like to measure the cost of other non-tradable goods or services, for example, for climate change, or how much would you value clean air, for those kind of environmental issues, it's also used. And the main way is to see how the crime is reflected in the real estate market. So how property prices are affected by crime, and how prices go down because of crime. So if we will have a house that is kind of a complex asset that will have different features like the square feet, the material, and also crime, and we take two houses that are more or less similar, but on crime, we would estimate more or less the cost of crime. Of course, as you can imagine, the problem is that houses that differ in their exposure to crime also differ in, for example, the quality of the schools around and many other things, which make this methodology very difficult to apply and to compare different cities or countries. In the previous publication, we have a case study on Mexico using these hedonic prices. We need kind of a shock on crime that affects crime and not other things, and to see the effects on the real estate market. So how do we compare countries, and how do we measure the cost of crime in a systematic way and as rigorous as possible? There is the accounting methodology, that is the one that we use here in this study. The accounting methodology puts in terms of money some of the components of the cost of crime that we made in that list. We take all the components that can be valued and measured in a fairly comparable way across countries. We have 17 countries here, and add them up. Yes? And we think that the main contribution of this study in terms of this methodology is that we apply a systematical way of estimating the cost of crime to 17 countries in the region and 6 developed countries to compare, to have as a benchmark. Yes? So when you take estimates of cost of crime, the key thing is to know what they include, because of everything I explained you before. What we do include is, first, public spending on security. So what these countries at the national or federal level, for the countries that have important subnational levels, the federal countries, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina. So what they spend on police, on criminal justice, on prison administration, that would be public spending on security. The second component is private spending on security, what firms and households spend on protection, on security services. And the third one is the social cost of crime, mainly due to victimization and the imprisonment. The social costs of crime are the more indirect costs that we are including in this accounting methodology. The victimization one is mainly homicides. So when someone died because of crime, so when someone is killed, apart from the loss of that life that has a value that is infinite and causes many problems for the family, and we will see for the economy, we can think of that loss as income that won't be generated in the future. So what we take to value victimization is homicides and some other violent crimes, and estimate the foregone income of those killed. We take the profile of those that were killed and estimate the stream of income that they won't generate in the future and bring it to 2014 values. Okay? There are methodologies to do that. We apply the standard methodologies also for other types of crime in terms of how can we value the loss of quality of life due to crime. Yes? And for imprisonment, when someone is in prison, there is also an opportunity cost in economic terms, because that person is not generating to the economy, to the GDP of the economy. He's not doing, or she, productive activities, as it happens in most of the countries in the region, unfortunately. And that's something that with the IDB we want to change as well. So to summarize, it's 3 components that we will show you in the cost of crime. Public spending on security, police, justice, and prison administration. Private spending, mainly firms, what they spend in private security, and social costs due to victimization and imprisonment. And most of it is due to homicides. What we don't include, anticipating questions, is the informal sector of the economy. We didn't find a rigorous way to incorporate it, although the informal sector is large in some countries. In the aggregate, we don't think that informal firms spend a lot in security. So in the aggregate, maybe in terms of their sales, it's a lot, but for the whole economy, maybe it's not that large. Anyway, what we want to say with this is that the estimates we provide are conservative, are a lower bound of the cost of crime, because we are only putting these three components together, and there are many things that we don't include that are important. Public spending on prevention programs are also not included. For example, when we do programs for youth at risk, those kind of things, because it's very hard to track them in the budget. We study all the budgets, and it's very hard to track them. And strictly speaking, if we think about prevention, we should also include spending on education, because there is a lot of literature on the crime-reducing effect of education and other kind of programs. Military spending, we don't include. We are focusing this study on citizen security, on the kind of work that we do at the IDB on crime that is in our cities, and not related to military problems or wars that fortunately we don't have in our countries. Nevertheless, we are aware that many countries, in light of the increase of violence, are using military forces also for citizen security purposes. It's hard to, in the budget, to estimate which share of that military forces are used. Only in El Salvador we could do that because it's explicit in the budget. Anyway, most of the spending is on police, and it's very high, but just a caveat of this potential shortcoming for some countries. Then there are intangible or some indirect costs we are not included, as I explained you before. And we have only 17 countries that are many, but the others were not included just for data limitations. We couldn't have the sources of information that we needed to estimate the cost of crime with the three categories that we use. That's the only reason for exclusion. Data sources, all the administrative data, it's all public data, what we use. We use victimization surveys for firms, for households, crime statistics, homicides, from UNODC, government budgets, national accounts. We needed a lot of census and household surveys to estimate the potential income, the foregone income of the imprisons, those that are killed, penitentiary census to see the profile of those imprisoned. And what we find in the 17 countries that will appear in blue here is that the cost of crime, on average, for this sample of 17 countries, is 3.55% of the GDP. So an average country will have a cost of crime of around 3.6% of its GDP, which is a lot. In terms of nominal values, in 2014 dollars, it's around $170 billion. It's around $1 per person per day in these countries. For you to have an idea of how large this is, we will give you some comparisons. The cost of crime in Latin America and the Caribbean would be enough to eradicate hunger in the world for 5 years, for example, or would be enough to double what the region spends on infrastructure. We could double bridges, roads, etc. We could have the region's housing deficit, or we could increase by 50% the spending on education, schools, teachers. So we want to show that crime is costly, and it's very important that the distortion that crime causes, they have an opportunity cost. So they could be then allocated for other things that will be better for development. An international comparison. What we get using the same methodology for Latin America and the Caribbean, this 3.6%, is double as much as the cost of crime for the average of the 6 developed countries that we analyze: US, UK, France, Australia, Canada, and Germany. US and UK also have a sizable cost of crime, around 2.5% of its GDP. Then we will see more or less what are the components of this. But it's double as in the developed world, we could say. And the heterogeneity we see in crime rates, in homicide rates, we also see it in the cost of crime. Here is by sub-region. Central America is certainly the region with the highest cost of crime. Then the Caribbean, then the Andean countries, and then South America, the Southern Cone. From 3 to, on average, to 4.5%. And how is the composition within these 3 components that we analyze? Most of it is public spending on security. And here is another important message we want to convey. It's not that the region is not spending on security. And we know that, and many of us here in this room contribute to that with a lot of programs to help the region. But it seems that in some countries, or in many countries, results the outcomes are not as good. And improvements in public spending and how that the money is spent is urgent. Private spending on security is also large and sizable. Maybe sometimes to substitute the lack of public, we didn't find the regularity on that. But we did find that private spending is more correlated with homicides rate or victimization rates than public spending, meaning that maybe the private sector is faster in adapting or is reacting in the way crime is moving. And then the social cost of crime, it's 0.64% of the GDP. Most of it is due to victimization. It's 12% of the overall costs. So public spending on security is 1.5% of the GDP of these countries. It's more than 3 times what is spent in the most important conditional cash transfers of poverty reduction programs. So it's a lot. And most of it is on police. Not only the cost of crime, but also the components of the cost of crime are different within the region and between countries. Some sub-regions like the Caribbean or South America have larger public spending on security, and some other regions like Central America have a lot of victimization costs due to the high rates of homicides. If we look at this by country, we see that the 3.5% of the GDP is hiding many differences. The range goes from 2% in the south, like Chile, Uruguay, to 6.5% in El Salvador or Honduras. And that's a lot. Mexico has a relatively small cost of crime in terms of GDP because its GDP is very large. In the publication, we also show the results per capita and in nominal terms, and in 2014 dollars, first comes Brazil and then comes Mexico. The components of the cost of crime also are different in the different countries. You can see them in detail in the book, but you can see that there are many opportunities for improvements in the allocation of private and public resources. And within, for example, public spending, a lot is in police forces. We include police, prison administration, and justice, but only the part of justice related to criminal justice, because there are other functions of the justice that we would need also in a no-crime scenario. There are countries with an increase in the prison population, like El Salvador, and then you can see there in yellow a large part of the cost of crime due to the opportunity cost of those in prison. So it's interesting to see in each country how the policy recommendations are different and how the situation is different. And data is very important. Another takeout from this study is the importance of information to guide policies and to understand what's going on. For example, to see that inside the countries there are also very different realities. We have a chapter on Brazil with the cost of crime estimated for the first time by state. We are planning to do that in the future in more countries. And there are the states of Brazil, and it's almost, if we would replicate the whole continent, given the continental dimension of Brazil, you get some countries, some states that are have costs around 6% of its GDPs, like Acre or Alagoas, similar to Honduras, and then you have other very, I don't know if so safe places, but with costs of crime lower, as in other South American countries as well. Here we have the comparison for you to have an idea of Latin America and the Caribbean and the US, because we did this to see the difference in the components. You see that public spending on security is almost the same in terms of the GDP. So the public spending on security in Latin America, it's around 1.5% of the GDP. It's almost the public spending on security of the countries that spend more, like US or UK, in terms of the GDP. But if we analyze the budget, the share of the budget that Latin American and Caribbean countries use for security is double as much as in the countries that spend more in developed countries. That gives you an idea of the relative importance that our countries give to security and to that sector. So in terms of the GDP, it's the same, but in terms of the share of the budget in Latin America and the Caribbean is double as much. In the US and in many developed, the share of private costs in the cost of crime, it's much smaller. And in the US, a highlight is that the social costs due to imprisonment, as you all know, are very large because US has the largest incarceration rate, and that is reflected in the large social costs due to imprisonment. So this is just an outlook of some things that you can find and to motivate you to download and to use the report as much as you can. Insecurity is a serious problem in the region. The cost of crime is around 3.55%, twice the amount as in the developed world. Huge variation within, across countries, between 2 and 6.5. This is a lot. And there are many areas of improvement, for example, better public spending, more efficient, analyze better the problems to target policies. There are many other issues that are covered in this volume that may be interesting for you. For example, we do an analysis of who are the victims of homicides, the profile of the victims. 50% are youth, 10% are women. There is a relation probably in some countries where the homicide rate of youth is twice or 3 times the population homicide rate to organized crime. That probably Angela will talk about that later. So what we want to raise your attention on is that when young people die, apart from all the losses, there is a huge loss in terms of potential future outcome and development and growth of this economy. So there are countries that generations of youth are dying because of violence. And that can be an economic problem also in the future, apart from the fact that these losses are priceless. Then we have a chapter on the penitentiary crisis. Many countries in the region in the last years tended to put more people in prison or jail as a response to crime. And this has a cost not only for the state in terms of public spending on prison administration, but also in terms of the opportunity cost of those people. So who are the people in prison, as Natalie mentioned, is very important. What alternative sanctions could be enacted? Violence against women is another issue in the region that is raising its profile. We don't have enough information, and it's very hard to estimate the cost of violence against women or the cost of gender-based violence, or to disaggregate this aggregate cost in females and males. What we did is some suggestive estimations of the cost of female homicides that are not always gender-based, but in our countries, not all of them have laws that determine when a homicide of a woman is a femicide or not. So, but there is suggestive evidence that the problem is really bad in the region with the few information we have available. Finally, we have a chapter on cybersecurity because the world evolves and the cyber economy gets larger and the threats gets larger. And there is another publication by the IBB on this topic because not only all crimes, but new crimes will be important and affect the welfare of citizens. There are many things we are studying apart from this. One is the distributed cost of crime. So crime doesn't affect all of the population in the same way. Poor seem to be more affected than rich. So crime is also regressive, not only costly, but regressive. It's important to estimate the cost of crime also in that sense, and in the previous publication there is some information on that. Another key thing is to evaluate future policies and to see the marginal cost and the marginal benefit of the different interventions, to see what of a publication we are preparing, to see the profile of who are the incarcerated. The theory of the cost of crime also needs a lot of work. For example, how to understand better the stolen goods market, the informal markets, the drugs market. That's a lot of work that was not even done for the developed world, and it's challenging, and I think it needs that we all work for that, because the informal economy poses many threats and in the region and in the developed world as well. Corruption is another costly crime that we didn't address, but as it is public knowledge, it's non-negligible in the region. How to incorporate that, and finally how to make public and police spending more efficient. This year we are doing another work on who are the police officers in Latin America and the Caribbean. That is the region that has one of the higher rates of police per inhabitants. So who are them? Why are the outcomes not there? So before thanking you, we wanted with Natalie to tell you really to think about how in these times of crime and to reduce crime, that it's a real burden for our countries. And the importance of generating knowledge and generating information, because this is a huge challenge, but as in every challenge, in every illness, information, good diagnostics, it's the beginning of trying to solve it. And science is of big help. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Laura. Thank you for that excellent presentation, and a lot of issues out there to talk about. So we're going to open up the discussion, but first we'll get comments from Angela and then Desmond, and then turn to all of you.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much, really. I'm honored to be here for the presentation of the book, and congratulations again for the excellent work that you have done. And we are partnering on different projects, and so really exciting to see this is coming out. Also because add a lot to the type of research that we do in UNODC. So let me maybe start first by saying what I found as a value added of the report and what really appreciated. And first of all is the transparency and the solidity of estimates. I mean, many of you maybe are into the business or research, and what at least sometimes we feel that there is a lot out there of coming with big numbers, and the biggest the better, and the more advocacy, and so it's almost a race. And we also receive always these questions. Oh, how big is the market of trafficking person? Can you tell us the value and so on? And we have really tried to refrain to come up just with a number for the sake of the numbers. And so I really appreciate the solid and the serious work done to really coming with serious numbers. It's because I'm not saying that we should not estimate the numbers and so on, but we should do it seriously. So I really appreciate this very rigorous information, the transparency also. That again, is not always a given. So really, I thought that that was really interesting. And the other thing is also the comparability. And, for those of us dealing with global research and so on, we always, comparability is the value added that we bring. And it's very important because with comparability, I think we can help the countries to understand their policy. And then I come to the other point that I think, in particularly the report, I think has very high relevance for national policy. And one of the questions that I would have is that what is the reaction of the countries? Because I found it, reading it, I thought, wow, if I was a country, I would find this extremely helpful to, reflecting on the efficiency of each country system. Not because, again, the other thing that we have when we do global research, member states usually hate, they say, it's not that it's your job to say who is the best and the worst, and indeed, that's not the point. But I thought that was useful because to say to the country, well, maybe your system, when you compare it to the others, this is more efficient or less efficient. And so I thought that was really very relevant. And the other thing that I really appreciated is also that it moves a little bit of the narrative and discussion of violence to the economic sphere. And as you said, Laura, in an environment of economic recessions in many places around the world, I think this brings the debate and the discussion on violence on a different level. So I think that was very appreciated. So now what I'm going to do is that, as you, again, as a researcher, that we have this cycle. We have a research question, then we gather the evidence, we try to answer the question. But then, once we have the conclusion, we discover a lot of questions that were unanswered. So I think I would like to pick it a little bit from one of your last slides, maybe just to chip in and say where maybe what kind of new questions this report stimulates, so that to think, and then to have maybe to have a suggestion on the next report. So the one thing that I wanted to say is that are we talking about cost of crime or cost of insecurity? And they're not the same thing. And I think that also the literature I think focus mostly on the cost of insecurity. And not all insecurity, and that's why I try to make it also graphically. I mean, not all insecurity is a crime. I mean, you may have administrative sanction. It could be so. Not everything, of course, the great majority, and not all crime is insecurity. And that's where I think I would bring my. You mentioned corruption, and also in the book, you mentioned, say, well, okay, we didn't cover the cost of corruption, but I would bring other illicit financial flows, money laundering, and many of those, I would call it invisible, and of course, much more difficult to measure, definitely. But in terms of the impact, they have very important economic impacts. And that again, they are not always very apparent because, you have something like price distortion. You have the unfair competition that you develop, for example, with corruption. And some of the distortive, you mentioned, Laura, the issue of for example, construction, where we say, the housing market, when you have a crime, may be decreasing. Well, what you have in some other forms of crime is that actually the housing market blooms. And you have bubbles of the housing market because you have, for example, the presence of organized crime. Those of you that have not been to Kabul you could see that in 2 years the housing market at this point, we may even argue that some of the Dubai things may come also from the drug money in Afghanistan, for example. Just to give an example, in other countries, in Europe as well, you have really areas where the housing market has, you see this big bubble, and to the point that you see some research measuring the presence of organized crime while measuring the construction business, for example. So this is, again, a question of where we go. And I wanted to zoom on the organized crime. Because that's what we research most, and again, particularly on the invisible cost of crime, of organized crime. Because I know in Latin America, there is all of this, I would say, almost rhetoric okay, there is a lot of violence because there is a lot of organized crime and a lot of drug trafficking. So what I wanted to argue is that actually, you know, and that is an example, I take drug trafficking just to give an example of organized crime, because that's what where we have most of information. And here you see the data on the homicide rate compared to the trafficking routes of Afghan heroin and cocaine, and then the production with cultivation of illicit crops. And you see that, for example, for the Afghan heroin, where countries that are not part of the route, and a lot of heroin going through. For the cocaine is actually the opposite, even if it's not so dramatic, but still, the cocaine, the trafficking is much more violent than the heroin. If we look at the production, you know, illicit cultivation, you see that, okay, there is a bit of a difference where there is more cultivation, but it's not really a big difference in terms of violence. So this is to say that organized crime can operate in a very secure. Crime operates. Organized crime prefers to operate in peaceful environment. I mean, the famous Pax Mafiosa and etc., because that's where they can do most business. And so one of the question, if we zoom in Latin America and we look at cocaine trafficking in Latin America, and here is the data from, you know, of the flow of cocaine coming from that reach the US through different countries in Latin America, and homicide rate. Basically, you see that you have the combination of homicide rate and flow of cocaine distributed almost equally. You have countries with very high flow of cocaine and high homicide rate, but you have countries with very high flow of cocaine and low homicide rate, or with a high homicide rate, very little cocaine going through. And the report has a chapter that describes a bit, you know, with case studies to see these striking differences. So again, what is that makes Latin America so violent? Why is cocaine trafficking more violent than heroin? We have done in the past some, I would say, come up with some explanations, and you know, but I have to say, this is still, I would say, still really an open question. I mean, we look a little bit and you see a bit of a difference, for example, the role of corruption. If you have a very centralized government system, you pay the highest rank, and then everything probably is more peaceful. While if you have differences where you have to pay many lower level men or different, maybe that could cause more violence. The absence of, for example, cocaine has triggered violence in Mexico. And that is the current, I mean, the current, even if before, maybe initially, this was triggered by the government intervention to stop the cocaine flow. But once you have less cocaine, then groups are fighting for a much smaller market. So all of this, I think, needs to be understood, because in terms of cost and impact is very different. And so what I'm trying to argue is that we need to really see how we can also measure the cost of this invisible, where there is no violence, but there is a lot of impact, even in economic impact, that we should measure. And I give you an example. Again, I mentioned the heroin because it's a striking opposite example of what happens, for example, in Central America. This is the Balkan route from Afghanistan to Europe of heroin, and this is again is very, I mean, with very little violence. As you may know, the majority of the violence in Europe is not relating to organized crime or drug trafficking. The majority of the violence there is relating to interpersonal violence. But what do we see? We have measured the impact in terms of the profit. And just as to understand this profit, like we estimated that annually, on an average, only the heroin, so you have to think that this is only heroin, is $28 billion every year that drug trafficking organization profit from this heroin trafficking. So what happened is with 28 billion, and the impact, the economic impact that they have in this. And the map that you see there, the different colors, is the percentage of GDP as compared to this profit. And you have countries like in Afghanistan, the airline business is 15% of the GDP. It's much larger than any export of Afghanistan. So you can imagine that when you have to deal with economic policy, you can definitely not ignore the impact that this profit has. And in a way, the impact in polluting the economic system of the country. So what we conclude is that organized crime can operate in peaceful mode with the impact on security, very little impact on security, by creating a distorted economic and social environment with high cost on society, economy, environment, human rights, and rule of law, which are not measured in terms of security costs. Why is it important that we measure this? And here I take from the report. There is, I want to quote it because I think that is really, really very telling. And it says, surveys show that many citizens are willing to trade their civil rights for security. And some are even beginning to doubt that democracy is the best form of government for their countries. So, and that's where I think is this invisible, because the cost of in terms of security is very visible, are the other costs that are not visible. And so now you can see, and it's not only some citizens. There are, I mean, I've seen a narrative that is coming also from research community, from also, some government community to say, well, maybe, okay, if organized crime can operate in peace, maybe we can trade it. Maybe that's fine. Maybe we don't have to, have the government going and destroy this peace. So, to me, in a way, is the most urgent to really quantify the invisible cost of organized crime, because I think it's important to balance, that we really show the balanced cost of the security, and I call it development in terms of a sustainable development goal, where you include everything, you include environment, economy, so in that sense. And we needed to, now we know in a way relatively well how to measure one, that is the violence. We don't know well how to do the others. And so in that sense, and it's important, is the last slide, that we always picture in UNODC what we call a vicious cycle that this kind of organized crime element brings, where you have, illicit markets, and then they reduce the investment, because nobody wants to invest in this kind of environment, then reduce the rule of law, and more you have this, the more they reinforce. So they develop an economy that is not an economy that look at the prosperity and the long term of the community. So how can we move from this vicious cycle to a virtuous cycle, where we actually, increase the improve the rule of law, improve economic development, and then we reduce the illicit activities. So with this, I conclude, just maybe what about the next report on the cost of organized crime in Latin America?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Final comment from Desmond.
So I wanted to echo what Angela said about the positive elements of the report. I won't dwell on them, but there was really a lot of really wonderful stuff in here. And I'll just talk about different questions that were raised by the report for me and the presentation that are worth talking about and using in the discussion. Part of this report put me in mind of understanding the Netflix series Narcos, the Brazilian-American production about Pablo Escobar, which is really sensationalist in terms of violence. I love the soundtrack, but it's really about blowing things up, and also about how Americans are going to save Colombians from themselves. But there was another show, right, which was a Colombian telenovela called Pablo Escobar, El Patrón del Mal. And the Pablo Escobar, the Colombian telenovela is actually a lot better. So if any of you have spare time to watch 70 episodes on your hands, it's there on Netflix for free if you're a subscriber. But this piece is a bit less about violence, though that's certainly there, but it's about constructing a new national Colombian myth of how the Colombian elite came together to respond to the predations of an organized crime syndicate operating in their midst. right? But also recognizing how Colombians themselves were implicated in corruption and created this organized crime structure. And it tells a much more nuanced story about crime, the causes of crime, and responses to crime. And I think that those contrasting stories have implications for understanding this volume. So as Angela said, there's a huge challenge, which I think that they've done a really great job dealing with, of understanding not just clandestine activities, right? So crime is in many ways a clandestine activity. You don't want to get caught robbing someone or murdering someone. And these are also activities that governments would like to keep quiet, right? So to produce a book like this, right, is really a remarkable contribution. And in fact, when I participated in the UN, United Nations Development Programs project on citizen security in Latin America in 2012 and 2013, one of the issues we discussed was, well, is there any analysis of the cost of crime in Latin America? We're all sitting around in a conference room in the UNDP building in Manhattan. We said, no, there's nothing. It's very sad. But now we have it. So this is great. We wish we'd had this 3 or 4 years ago to put that in the report. And it's awesome that that's there. And so that's a really good contribution. In terms of my own experience, I'm not an economist, and I don't work at the broad national level for the most part. I look at cities and I look at neighborhoods within cities, so understanding the crime context in very narrow spaces, but doing it comparatively to make larger inferences. So some of my questions are, in terms of economics, a bit naive, and also point in slightly different directions than maybe the direction of the presentation. So I'll ask the questions and put these ideas out there, and you can address these as you would like as you move forward. One of the issues that came up was a lot of the smaller countries and smaller population states in Brazil seem to have relatively higher costs than larger countries and larger population states, which suggests to me that there was an economy of scale issue that I was wondering what you were thinking about, right? That if you're like dealing with Honduras, well, there's just not that many people, right? So the police cost more to run, no matter how violent the country is. And I think that might be something to reflect on in this case, and how countries could address that. Another issue that I had was social costs. So you talk about a number of factors, such as people, real estate as a way of measuring cost, and people dying, and sort of talking about the social profile of people dying. And I'm wondering, one of the questions that came to me, because I've worked in a lot of less well-off areas, is how well, or to what extent, the experience of the poor is well incorporated into your models, right? So if a poor person is murdered, right, does that show up as a lower cost in your study? Also, we're talking about the informal housing market in a lot of cases, these places that are very violent. How do you measure the costs, the value of the informal real estate market, and what implications does that have for your study? The authors are to be commended for their subnational focus. That's another thing that's very important to me, and it came up in our discussions in the Citizen Security Report for the UNDP. In Brazil, there's an inference made that wealthier states seem to have a bit less crime than poorer states. And my reading of this was that actually this was a particular moment in Brazilian history that you're capturing. Because if you go back to the 1990s or the 1980s, it was Rio and Sao Paulo that had the highest murder rates. And now this is sort of shifted as Brazil and Sao Paulo have sort of gotten crime rates under control, and we're seeing higher murder rates in other countries. So it's not poverty that's yielding higher amounts of violence. It's a certain historic process that's going on. And I think here Marcelo Bergman's recent work on crime and economic development is really important. So what he's argued is that actually the question about crime levels has to do with the rise of consumer demand in particular places. And so what you're seeing in places like Alagoas and Salvador, especially after 16 years of 12 to 16 years of Workers' Party rule in Brazil, is an increasing quality of life for the poor and the working class in the northeast of Brazil especially. And Bergman would argue that's associated with higher levels of crime because now you have a consumer basis to demand crime among that population. And I thought that might be worth reflecting on. In terms of policies, I felt the report remained at the level of generalities, but I also felt that that was the intention. It was sort of to put out there an evaluative method to determine policies. So I didn't think that was necessarily wrong, but I did want to ask the authors what policies that this is pointing to in particular, how they saw this implicated in successful policies in different places, and how this could inform particular types of policies. But I also wanted to raise another question, which gets back to the social cost question, right? So if we analyze crime control, on a cost-benefit basis, right, it creates a tension with what many people ultimately experience, not as an issue of cost-benefit analysis, but rather a moral issue or an issue of basic justice, right, and contact with the state, right? Whether you suffer a crime isn't so much whether you lost $50. It's the sense of you being violated, right? It's the sense of loss to yourself and your family, depending on the crime. I'm conducting a study right now with Hugo Fröhling in Chile and some other collaborators there. And we surveyed 2,500 people in Bogota, Lima, and Santiago. And Santiago had a very interesting result on one question, which is a lot of people in Santiago, that, despite the effectiveness of the carabineros in controlling crime in Santiago, a lot of people in Santiago are very critical of crime, especially in poor neighborhoods. And one of the big criticisms they raise is that the carabineros tend to operate out of very centralized precincts, right, that do a good job of controlling crime and probably controlling costs, but mean that if you're at an outlying region of the city, right, and especially in a poor neighborhood where you are experiencing a lot of crime, there isn't necessarily a precinct house, right, or a police booth in your particular area. So people feel distanced from the carabineros and are very critical of them for this. And they see the carabineros, and this also comes out in their qualitative data, as being not unresponsive to this question, right? So this is ultimately a cost-benefit analysis, right? But it crosses in very complicated ways with people's sense of justice and what they expect out of the state in terms of response time and attentiveness to their needs. And I guess that was a question that I wanted you to reflect on in terms of the implication for your study. One question I had about the Central American piece was there's a lot of heterogeneity in homicides, but El Salvador seems to be, if you look at the pattern of homicide hotspots, seems to be going through a process of a random walk, right? It just moves around all the time. Whereas if you look at Guatemala and Honduras, homicides are really concentrated in specific places. It's heterogeneous, but there's consistency to that heterogeneity. I was wondering how you reflected on that. And I wanted to get back at the end to the question of organized crime. And I agreed with basically everything Angela said about organized crime. And I've done a lot of research on organized crime in Latin America. And what I wanted to focus on here was the chapter on organized crime. And there were a few points that I wanted to make here. The El Salvador piece focuses mostly, the El Salvador case study focuses mostly on maras, but organized crime is also separate from the maras. Right? So you have gangs, but you also have large-scale trafficking organizations. I didn't feel that maybe was explored as much as it could, that particular bifurcated dynamic was explored quite as much as it could have been in that piece. The Jamaica part, I thought that what was written about Jamaica was interesting, although I would point out that while homicides were really at a particularly low point with the last data point that you offer in that study, they've risen 30% in the last 2 years. So some of the conclusions of that particular analysis, of that particular case study, I have questions about. But you also come to the question of this piece at the end is an exhortation. Governments need to respond to this. Organized crime is a big problem, and we need to begin to develop policies. But why did Jamaican policy, right, which this piece lauds, shift in 2010? It shifted precisely because of U.S. pressure, not because the Jamaican elite wanted to, not because anybody wrote a report and said, organized crime is a problem in Jamaica. Jamaica has known for 40 years that at that point, 40 years that organized crime was a problem. It shifted because the United States indicted Christopher Koch, who was the criminal who ran the neighborhood that the prime minister was elected out of, right? The prime minister almost scuttled his entire political career trying to avoid having to extradite him. And then had to declare an emergency, use the military to extract him, leading to the death of 72 Jamaicans who were not involved in criminal activities. And this comes back to the question of El Patrón del Mal, right, which is the role of national elite in propagating organized crime and criminality. Thomas Carruthers asks an important question about this in his writing about corruption. He says, well, we've got all these anti-corruption programs going to Eastern Europe. He says, but they're all failing. Why are they failing? It's because even though we tell people how to control corruption, the people who are in those countries are interested in maintaining that particular dynamic in the country. In some cases because it actually minimizes potential violence, but in other cases because they're directly profiting from it or because it's part of their governance strategy. So I guess I wanted to push you more on that, right? I think in terms of organized crime, we need to go beyond exhortations about let's not do organized crime. Here are some strategies. We need to talk about how to unwind relationships between political elite in Guatemala, where a number of political elites have been indicted, in Venezuela, in Jamaica, to begin to bring that under control. And one country that actually has achieved this to a certain extent is Colombia, and they've profited immensely from it in terms of overall levels of violence. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Well, lots of questions. Our time is running out. I don't know if people want to stay a little bit over, or I don't know, because we want to get maybe one or two questions
Yes.
from the audience and then come back to Laura and Natalie. Yes, Pat, if you could please tell us who you are and just be brief.
Patricia Fagan, Georgetown University. First, congratulations. The presentations were really enlightening and the commentaries very thought-provoking. But the question, I'm looking I haven't read the report, I just saw the report now. But I'm looking, the figures are almost all from 2014, the evaluations. They may be different years, I'm sure they were gathered over a course of years. So my question, I hope not unfair, is that does anyone on the panel think that the figures would be different, the cost analyses would be different, were they taken in different years? I'm thinking of Desmond's comment that Rio and Sao Paulo were the crime centers at one time, now they're not, so things change. And if you think there would be, you haven't got the figures, I understand. If you think they would be different in different years, would this have anything to do with the public expenditures on combating this kind of crime? Or is it more due to the nature of the criminal activity?
Thank you. Yes, you have a question?
Sure. So Elena Teacher-Rooney from USAID. I think I have two questions. One is more of a comment, but in terms of measuring extortion, especially extortion on poor populations, I want to know how, you didn't mention it in your presentation, but, and I know there's very little data available on actual extortion rates, but looking forward to potential research, how do you see how we could start to take that into account as well? And then the second comment that I wanted to make in terms of the social costs, the CDC has done some really interesting research about the impact of being a victim of crime or witness to crime on health impacts and sort of social costs in that way moving forward. If you see any potential links that you can do in terms of what data is available or plans to do research on that in the future.
Great, thanks. And we have two questions here, and then we'll go back to, yes, please, yes. And then we'll go to the gentleman behind you.
Well, Dr. Correa, fellow at the Wilson Center. I would like to know how you evaluate private security and the cost of private security, because in El Salvador, in Honduras, there's a big concern about the private security companies and its role, not only alleviating violence, but contributing to increased violence and the connection with organized crime and other activities is very complex.
Thank you.
What you can say about that.
Great, thank you. Sorry.
Alistair G, Institute for Economics and Peace. Thank you. Wonderful report. And we do economic value of violence reduction in 163 countries. In fact, going back more than 5 years, and we have the extortion data you might want. What we're working on is, and the value of this report to us is how to convert the cost into financial instruments. And as one of the biggest loaners for violence reduction projects, interesting what you see is the future in that and how to ramp up investment.
Great, thank you. Well, I think we have a lot of questions. Not enough time to respond to all of them, but I'll let Laura and if Natalie wants to say anything as well.
Yes, I think just a general comment regarding the reaction of governments and how we can translate a study like that into public policy. The reaction has been very positive. I mean, we had a lot of questions, and some governments were even surprised, just to see the data reflected that. We had a lot of discussions, especially with the finance ministers, that they were very interested in the report. Can you imagine all the security sector asking for more police? The situation is so bad that we need more money. And the next questions that they have is, for what? And what did you do with the money that we also give you? So this is all, it starts a good conversation. And as Professor Desmond said, it's a report that puts something in there that we start the conversation and we start building on that information. And this is what inspires the government now to say, okay, now we know at least how much. Now let's answer the next question is how are we spending? And this is our next step with governments, and then we're starting the cost effectiveness of programs in different, with the police, with the social prevention, and I think that is going to be a great step for the governments to understand how they're spending in security. And regarding the organized crime, this is an area that IDB it doesn't have an expertise. We don't see the value added in terms of in our mandate. But this is why, we have to create that type of alliance that we're doing with the UNODC. They are the experts on that and the research, but also the information is valued for that in terms that we cannot separate that also organized crime is creating a lot of the interpersonal violence and the drive of the homicides that we are seeing in the region. And this is why we see that as a great partnership. And also, I wanted to, go back to the question to Angela, because I heard also that the settings where the organized crime is developing in terms of institutions, which is for us in Latin America, and I want to convey that message, is the importance to build institutions. It's not just to get support, it's building institutions. And one of the major success of the Colombian history is how strong the institutions were, security and police and justice, and this is how you build also a way that people feel that is an institution to protect them, they can access to justice, and that they can be also have, in a certain way, be protected as a victim. And what just the general comments, I pass on Laura for more details.
Some questions. Thanks for the questions and thanks for the great comments. It's very enriching and we have a lot of work to do, hopefully joint work and a future research agenda, because there are more questions than answers in this, and we are responsible for finding answers for those questions. In terms of the reaction of the governments, actually, this was a result of requests by governments. After the 2015 publications, the IDB received letters saying, so we want, how much is it's crime in our countries? And we got many requests, and it was more demand-driven. So hopefully they will continue along those lines, asking for more things and to deepen the discussion, as Natalie mentioned. So far, we're very happy about that outcome. For example, we got more requests to do cost effectiveness and analysis of the penitentiary systems of some countries, an alternative to prisons programs. So we are happy about that, and that was the main aim. Then on the next questions, apart from the research agenda that we mentioned briefly, Natalie mentioned some of the products that are coming soon, and I mentioned some others. I think that there are two. One is that in public policy, but mostly in security policies, decisions are made because of ideology, because of intuition, and how do we transform, how we infuse change in the way governments design, for example, on the allocation of the spending on security, on what to spend, how to spend it. So this is one of the objectives of this, to motivate this kind of discussion of how the decisions are made in terms of security programs, interventions. On police, we are doing a book on police reform, because policing is one of the main spendings on security in these countries. And answering part of your question, police legitimacy, not only like how many officers are there and what are their incentives, their qualifications, their expertise, their capabilities, but also how to create legitimacy that in these countries is a serious problem. So how decisions are made, how to make them more evidence-based, and how to make at the same time that the evidence that is not available in the region, one in policing, and the other strand of this agenda is on informal or illegal markets, as I mentioned, and overlapping with what Angela suggested. Informal markets are very large, it seems. Property crimes, as you mentioned, is an issue, not only homicides, but there are many other crimes that maybe due to increases in the GDP and the income of many people. Inequality may have affected this as well. So police and informal markets, illegal markets of all sorts, that you already mentioned them in a great detail, are next areas that we think that should be deepened in the study. Regarding many of your comments, they are out of the scope of this aggregated analysis, and we are trying to answer some of them with disaggregated subnational level, city level studies. We have many of them ongoing. For example, some in terms of geographical distribution of crime, we are conducting with geocoded crime data, the incident level where it happened, and we find kind of what you mentioned. There is a lot of concentration crime in the cities. We explore 6 cities in the region. 50% of crime is produced only by 5% of the street segments, as in the US, for example. But there is more dynamics going on in our cities rather than in the US, where the hotspots or the developed cities seem to be more stable. So there are other, we can share it later, studies and answer for your questions that we are pursuing in other studies, but that was not the scope of this one. But for sure, they are very interested. For example, looking at the effect of different programs in Brazil, why some states could reduce crime, doing evaluations. The cost of crime is like unemployment. It's something bad that it's there, but the important thing is what are the marginal costs and marginal benefits of the potential interventions that we are applying to reduce it. Yes. So these kind of studies are for sure important, and we are doing that. In extortions, that was a question that was asked in different types. It is important in Central America. We are aware of that. It's not included here. We are doing a study, for example, because the official statistics are very poor. People tend not to report extortions. In El Salvador, it's a main crime. Most of the prison population is in prison due to extortion. And we are doing a survey there in small and medium-sized firms, a big one, to understand extortion. So how is extortion, and many details. It was in the field last month, so probably this year we may have some results to start digging in that problem that affects the informal economy a lot, as you mentioned. On health impacts and other impacts that you asked, it's a great question as well. This is kind of general equilibrium analysis. So there are many partial equilibrium analysis of different effects of crime that are certainly significant for development and for growth. In the previous study, there were some case studies of assessments of the health impact, for example, for children, of crime and violence. So these are more partial studies, and it's hard to compare across countries. That was what we wanted here, but there is a lot of literature on that as well. And then on private security, there's another thing that many governments are concerned. Some and the population, they feel that they need it, but it's also kind of a business. We got those messages as well, and those concerns. It's an industry. It's very hard to study. We are trying in some countries when we ask, when we do these victimization surveys, maybe Angela wants to talk about that, to try to see how people protect themselves, what's the demand for those services. Also in the El Salvador one, we are trying to understand how they are protecting themselves. It's very hard, but it is an important part of the cost of crime that we should analyze better. For example, in Brazil, it's a large share of the cost of crime.
Great, thank you. I'm sorry we went over a little bit, but I think this has been absolutely terrific. I want to congratulate you on this great study and report. As I said, I think a measure of its success is that it does generate a lot of questions and stimulate conversation, and I think motivates all of us to continue working on these issues. So I want to thank you so much for that. Natalie, congratulations. Laura. Angela, great to have you with you. Come back to Washington here more often. Desmond, I'm glad you're close by. We always get a lot of dialogue discussions. Well, congratulations on your book, and we'll see if we'll do an event on your book when it comes out. Thank you all for coming this morning. Very much.